What happens when a group of men target the wrong woman, thinking no one will care? In a quiet neighborhood where silence and indifference have long reigned, one woman's strength will shake the very foundation of her community. Eleanor Brooks, a widow who's spent decades walking the familiar streets of Maple Street with her loyal dog Bear, has lived a life defined by quiet resilience. But one evening, that peace is shattered when four men confront her with threats, mocking words, and intentions far darker than they first appear. What they don't realize is that Eleanor is no easy target. Her courage and Bear's fierce loyalty turns a moment of danger into something far greater, a fight for justice, dignity, and change. As the events unfold, fear lingers like a shadow, but so does an unexpected light. Neighbors who once kept to themselves begin to look up, speak out, and stand together. What begins as a harrowing encounter becomes a story of strength, unexpected kindness, and the power of community rising to face its fears. The afternoon sun dipped low in the sky, casting long golden shadows on Maple Street. Eleanor Brooks adjusted her sun hat with one hand while holding the leash of her Rottweiler Bear with the other. The silver locket around her neck glinted faintly in the sunlight as she walked. The street was quiet, almost too quiet. Maple Street had always been that way, peaceful on the surface, with a tension that simmered just beneath. Eleanor had lived here for over 30 years. She had moved into the house with her late husband, Samuel, back when the neighborhood felt warmer. The Brooks house was modest but sturdy. Painted a soft beige with a little porch swing out front, it stood as a testament to years of hard work and small joys. The inside was filled with pieces of Samuel's life-old photographs on the mantel, a worn-out chair where he used to read his paper, and the faint scent of his aftershave that lingered no matter how many years passed. Eleanor was in her mid-60s now. Her movements were deliberate and dignified. She was not frail, nor did she allow the world to see her as such. Her face, lined with the wisdom of years, carried a quiet strength. She was proud, but not boastful. Resilient, yet often weary. The neighborhood had changed over the years. New families came in, old ones moved out. Eleanor had watched Maple Street become quieter, colder. Her skin color made her stand out in ways that some people found uncomfortable. Eleanor knew what that silence meant, the avoidance of eye contact, the mumbled greetings, the closed curtains when she walked by. She had learned to rise above it, to hold her head high and refuse to let the world's smallness shrink her spirit. Bear, her loyal Rottweiler, was her greatest companion. He was large and imposing, with a muscular frame and glossy black coat. His soft brown eyes, however, held nothing but love for Eleanor. Bear had been a gift from Samuel years before his passing. Samuel had known Eleanor would need someone to look after her when he was gone, and Bear had stepped into that role with unwavering devotion. As they walked, Bear's ears perked up, and his tail wagged faintly. Eleanor smiled down at him. "Good boy, Bear," she murmured, tightening her grip on the leash. The sidewalks were empty, the occasional house still and silent. Eleanor liked her afternoon walks. They were part of her routine, something constant and dependable. The streets, though chilly with judgment, were familiar to her. She knew every house, every mailbox, every crack in the pavement. This was her home. No one could take that from her. She turned onto Willow Lane, the quietest street in the neighborhood. The tall oaks on either side of the road cast long shadows across the sidewalk, and the soft hum of cicadas filled the air. As Eleanor walked, her thoughts wandered. She thought about Samuel. She missed the way he would hold her hand during these walks. She thought about how the world had felt different then, simpler, perhaps. Bear suddenly tensed beside her, his ears flattening and his shoulders stiffening. Eleanor frowned and looked down at him. "What is it, boy?" she asked softly. Her gaze followed his, and that was when she noticed it, a pickup truck. The truck was a few houses down, parked along the curb, but moving slowly. Too slowly, Eleanor's heart skipped a beat. 4 young men sat inside, leaning out of the windows. Their laughter was sharp, cutting through the quiet like a knife. Bear let out a low growl, the sound rumbling deep in his chest. Eleanor's grip on the leash tightened. "Just keep walking," she whispered to herself, keeping her pace steady. She did not look back, but she could feel their eyes on her. The truck crawled along, matching her pace. "Nice dog," one of the men shouted. His voice was mocking, almost playful, but laced with something darker. Eleanor ignored him, her pulse quickening. Bear growled again, his body moving closer to hers, as though shielding her from the truck. "Where you headed so fast, ma'am?" another voice called. Eleanor could hear the others laughing. The truck came to a stop. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. She wanted to turn and run, but she knew better than that. Samuel had always taught her to stand firm, to never show weakness. She stopped walking instead, her back straight and her chin lifted. Slowly she turned to face the men. The tallest of the group climbed out of the truck first. He was broad-shouldered, with a cold grin that did not reach his eyes. The others followed, flanking him. They were young, maybe in their early 20s, but their postures were dripping with arrogance. "Afternoon, ma'am," the tall one said, his voice smooth but condescending. His eyes darted to the silver locket at her throat. "Nice jewelry you got there." Eleanor's stomach twisted, but she did not let it show. "It's a beautiful day, isn't it?" she replied, her voice even and calm. The man's grin widened. "Sure is." He took a step closer. "Where'd you get that necklace? Bet it's worth something." "It is," Eleanor said firmly, "but it's not for sale." Bear growled again, louder this time. The men flinched slightly at the sound, but the tall one waved it off. "Relax," he said, his grin slipping just a little. "We're just admiring." "Admire from a distance," Eleanor snapped, her voice sharp now. She took a deliberate step forward, Bear moving with her. The men laughed, but there was unease in their eyes. The red-faced man, shorter than the leader but stocky, stepped closer, his face twisting into a sneer. "Why so defensive? Ain't nobody gonna care if something happens to an old lady like you." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. The words hit her like a slap. The quiet prejudice of the town had never been so boldly spoken to her face. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt, but Bear's growl brought her back. "You picked the wrong woman to mess with," Eleanor said coldly. Her voice did not waver. "If you don't back off now, you'll regret it." The tall man stepped closer still. "You talk big, lady. Maybe that dog ain't as tough as you think." In an instant, Bear barked a loud, commanding sound that echoed down the street. He lunged forward, his muscles coiled like a spring. The red-faced man stumbled back, cursing under his breath. The others froze, their laughter dying. "Call him off!" the red-faced man shouted, but Eleanor held her ground. "I warned you," Eleanor said evenly. Her hand on Bear's leash was steady, her posture unyielding. "This is on you." The tall man hesitated, his bravado faltering. The sound of tires screeching broke the moment. A car pulled up across the street, and a woman stepped out, phone in hand. "Is everything okay here?" she called loudly. Her voice was sharp, filled with authority. The men stiffened, glancing at one another. "Come on, man. This ain't worth it," one of the others muttered. The tall man shot Eleanor a look that held both anger and fear. "You'll regret this," he muttered before turning back toward the truck. The others followed him, scrambling into the vehicle. The truck roared to life and sped down the street, disappearing around the corner. Eleanor exhaled a shaky breath, her heart still racing. She turned to see the woman who had intervened approaching. She was young, maybe in her 30s, with blonde hair tied in a ponytail and a determined expression. "Are you okay?" the woman asked. "I called the police. They'll be here soon." Eleanor nodded slowly, her voice soft but firm. "Thank you. I am okay." The woman smiled faintly. "I'm Rachel. I live a few streets over. I saw them following you and thought you might need help. Eleanor looked at her, surprised. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did, Rachel replied. We look out for each other around here. Eleanor's chest tightened at the words. For so long, she had felt alone in this neighborhood, unseen and unacknowledged. This small act of kindness, so unexpected, felt like a lifeline. As Rachel stayed by her side, waiting for the police to arrive, Eleanor realized something. Not everyone was silent. Not everyone was blind to what was happening. There were still people who cared. She looked down at Bear, who was standing tall and watchful. Good boy, she whispered, stroking his head. He wagged his tail slightly, his eyes still sharp and alert. Eleanor lifted her head and looked toward the horizon, the sun sinking lower behind the oaks. The shadows might have been long, but they did not last forever. The patrol cars flashing red and blue lights washed over the quiet houses of Maple Street as Officer Mike Carter stepped out, his broad figure framed against the dimming sky. Eleanor Brooks stood on the edge of the sidewalk, Bear sitting calmly at her feet, though his body was still tense. Rachel Green, the woman who had intervened, stood beside Eleanor, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Mrs. Brooks, Officer Carter greeted her with a nod, his voice calm and steady, though his eyes flicked toward the empty street where the truck had disappeared. Are you all right? I am fine, officer, Eleanor replied evenly. Her hands rested on Bear's leash, her knuckles white. The adrenaline from the encounter still coursed through her veins, but she wouldn't let it show. Rachel spoke up. I saw them, 4 of them, in a dark pickup truck. They got out and started threatening her. It was bad. If it weren't for her dog— Bear sat proudly, as if he understood the praise being directed at him. Officer Carter crouched slightly, offering Bear a respectful pat on his head. Good job, boy, he said softly, before turning back to Eleanor. Did they say anything specific to you? Eleanor hesitated for only a moment, her mind replaying the venomous words the red-faced man had spat at her. No one's going to care about you. They wanted my necklace, she finally said. Her voice was level, though the memory of their mocking laughter made her stomach turn. One of them tried to grab it, but Bear stopped him. Officer Carter nodded gravely. We'll file a full report. We'll also increase patrols around the area for the next few days. I need you to be careful, Mrs. Brooks. Eleanor looked at him with sharp, unwavering eyes. I am always careful. Carter's lips quirked in something resembling a smile, but it quickly faded. It's good that your dog was there, he said, rising to his full height. But next time, call 911 as soon as you feel uneasy. You don't have to face something like this alone. Rachel added, and if you need someone to walk with you, just call me. I live 2 streets over. I'd be happy to. Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by Rachel's sincerity. Thank you, she said, her voice quieter now. It wasn't often that someone offered her help without asking for anything in return. Let me walk you home, Rachel offered. Eleanor hesitated, but the thought of walking alone after what had just happened made her shoulders stiffen. I suppose I would not mind the company. The 2 women walked side by side, Bear leading the way with his steady gait. The silence that followed felt heavy, but not uncomfortable. Rachel glanced sideways at Eleanor after a moment. I'm sorry you had to deal with that, Rachel said softly. It's not right. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. No, it is not, but it happens. Rachel's brow furrowed. It shouldn't. People like that think they can get away with anything. Eleanor exhaled, a slow and measured sound. People like them only have power when no one speaks up. That's why you're strong, Rachel said. You stood up to them. Eleanor glanced at her, surprised by the admiration in her voice. She didn't feel particularly strong. Her hands were still trembling slightly, though she kept them hidden in her coat pockets. I had no choice. Rachel gave a small smile. Sometimes, that's when strength matters the most. When they reached Eleanor's house, Rachel paused on the porch, tucking her hands into the pockets of her jacket. "If you need anything, just let me know," she said earnestly. "It's good to have someone on your side." Eleanor studied her, trying to read between the lines. Rachel seemed genuine, and something about her presence eased the lingering tension in Eleanor's chest. She gave a small nod. "Thank you. I appreciate it." Rachel smiled. "Good night, Mrs. Brooks, and good night, Bear." She scratched Bear behind the ears before walking back toward her car, disappearing into the growing darkness. Eleanor watched her go, the street feeling just a bit less cold than it had before. She unlocked the door and stepped into her house, Bear following closely behind. The familiar silence greeted her, wrapping around her like a heavy blanket. She set her keys on the small table by the door and hung her coat neatly on the hook. Bear trotted over to his favorite spot by the living room window and sat, his head tilted slightly as he watched the empty street. Eleanor moved to the kitchen and filled Bear's bowl with food, her hands steadying with the rhythm of routine. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, her gaze falling on the silver locket around her neck. It had been Samuel's last gift to her, and it carried a weight that no one else could understand. "No one cares about you." The words lingered in her mind like a dark stain. She had spent her entire life proving otherwise, working as a teacher, building a home with Samuel, and standing tall when the world seemed intent on making her small. And yet, there were moments like tonight when the isolation crept in. Bear nudged her knee, pulling her from her thoughts. His soft brown eyes looked up at her with quiet understanding. Eleanor smiled faintly and reached down to scratch behind his ears. "You were brave tonight, Bear," she said softly. "I could not have done it without you." Bear wagged his tail once, the sound of it tapping against the floor a comfort. Later that night, as Eleanor lay in bed, she found herself staring at the ceiling. The house felt too quiet, too still. The events of the evening played in her mind on an endless loop. The mocking voices, the truck crawling beside her, the cold words that cut deeper than she cared to admit. But then she remembered Rachel stepping out of her car, her voice sharp with concern and authority. "Is everything okay here?" That moment had been like a small light in the darkness, a reminder that not everyone would look away. Eleanor turned onto her side, her hand brushing against the empty space where Samuel used to sleep. "You were right," she whispered into the quiet. "There are still good people out there." The next morning, Eleanor found herself lingering at the front window as Bear sat beside her, alert as always. The neighborhood was waking up, the usual hum of cars and distant voices filling the air. She watched as Mr. James Bennett, her reclusive neighbor from across the street, shuffled down his driveway to collect his newspaper. He glanced toward Eleanor's house and paused, lifting his chin slightly in acknowledgement. It was a small gesture, almost imperceptible, but Eleanor noticed it. For the first time in years, she lifted her hand and waved. To her surprise, Mr. Bennett gave a small wave back before disappearing into his house. Eleanor turned away from the window, her expression thoughtful. The world had felt unkind for so long that she had almost forgotten what moments like that could mean. Maybe Rachel was right. Maybe strength mattered most when you felt you had no choice but to find it. As Bear nudged her hand, Eleanor reached for his leash and smiled faintly. "All right, boy," she murmured. "Let's go for our walk." She paused before stepping outside, her eyes falling on the pepper spray Rachel had given her the night before. It sat on the kitchen counter, small but significant. Eleanor picked it up, tucking it carefully into her coat pocket. The street outside was still quiet, but today it felt different. Eleanor held her head high as she stepped onto the sidewalk, Bear trotting confidently beside her. For the first time in a long time, she felt as though she was not entirely alone. The crisp morning air settled on Maple Street as Eleanor Brooks and Bear walked the familiar path. The sunlight trickled through the tall oaks, dotting the sidewalk in patterns of light and shadow. Bear walked with his usual steady stride, his ears perked and head held high, as though he sensed his role had grown even more important since the night before. Eleanor felt the weight of the pepper spray tucked securely into her coat pocket. Rachel's small gift from the previous night gave her an odd sense of reassurance. As her shoes crunched softly against the pavement, she scanned the street. The houses were quiet, their curtains drawn. The neighborhood might have woken up, but Eleanor doubted anyone was paying attention to her walk. But someone had paid attention last night. Rachel Green had noticed. She had stopped. That thought lingered in Eleanor's mind, creating a crack in the armor of resignation she had worn for so long. For decades, she had accepted the subtle looks, the silence, and the way the neighborhood seemed to fold in on itself whenever she passed. It was easier to expect nothing. That way, when kindness appeared rare as it was, it felt like something extraordinary. Bear let out a low huff, his head swiveling toward a parked car up ahead. Eleanor frowned, following his gaze. A familiar dark pickup truck sat at the corner of the block, its engine off, but it was unmistakable. Eleanor froze mid-step. Her heartbeat quickened, pounding in her chest as if it wanted to escape. Bear sensed her unease, his body shifting closer to her side, his head lowering slightly as he growled softly. The truck just sat there, silent and unmoving, but Eleanor felt the sharp edge of its presence. She forced herself to keep walking, though her steps were slower now. If they were watching, she would not let them see her fear. Her eyes darted across the street toward a small house with a faded blue mailbox. Behind the mailbox, someone was crouched down, tending to a flower bed. It was James Bennett, her quiet, gruff neighbor. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before deciding to cross the street. As she approached, Bear at her side, James straightened up slowly, wincing as he stretched his back. His gaze flicked toward her, sharp beneath bushy gray brows. "Morning," he grunted. His voice was low, gravelly like a man unused to long conversations. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," Eleanor replied, her voice calm despite the unease still twisting in her chest. She glanced briefly over her shoulder at the truck, still parked down the block. James followed her gaze, squinting against the sunlight. "Something wrong?" Eleanor hesitated. She wasn't sure why she'd crossed the street, only that she felt a pull to stand near someone, anyone. "No," she replied after a pause. "Just out for a walk." James grunted again, wiping his hands on the worn towel slung over his shoulder. He didn't press the issue, though his gaze lingered on the truck for a beat longer than necessary. "You've got a good dog there," he said, nodding toward Bear, who sat patiently by Eleanor's side. "Rottweiler, huh? Sturdy breed. Loyal." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "He's been with me for a long time. He's always taken care of me." James met her eyes briefly, his expression unreadable. "Looks like he still is." For a moment, neither of them said anything. Eleanor couldn't explain why, but standing there just talking to someone made the fear settle in her chest, even if only for a moment. "Be careful out there, Mrs. Brooks," James said finally, his voice low and steady. "Not everyone's got sense these days." Eleanor nodded. "I will, Mr. Bennett." With a final glance at the truck, she tugged Bear's leash gently. "Come on, boy." They continued their walk, though Eleanor remained aware of her surroundings. The pickup truck stayed parked on the corner until Eleanor turned onto another street and lost sight of it. She wasn't foolish enough to believe it was gone for good, but she refused to let it keep her inside. When she returned home, she fed Bear and made herself a cup of tea. The sound of the kettle's whistle filled the silence, and for a moment, Eleanor let herself relax at the kitchen table. Bear settled near her feet, his soft breaths a reminder that she was not alone. The rest of the day passed quietly. Eleanor kept herself busy tidying the house, tending to the small garden Samuel had started years ago, and writing a letter to her niece who lived in Georgia. The sun dipped low in the sky once more, casting an amber glow through the curtains. Eleanor considered skipping her evening walk, but something inside her refused to yield to fear. The street was empty again as she stepped outside, Bear's leash in hand. She walked a different route this time, avoiding Willow Lane altogether. The events of the night before still haunted her, though she pushed the memories down. As she turned a corner, Eleanor heard a familiar voice behind her. "Mrs. Brooks?" She stopped and turned to see Rachel Green jogging to catch up, a warm smile on her face. Rachel wore a dark green jacket and carried a small canvas bag over her shoulder. "Good evening," Eleanor greeted her. Rachel slowed to a walk beside her. "I saw you out here and thought I'd join you if you don't mind." Eleanor arched a brow, though she felt an unexpected warmth at the offer. "I do not mind." Rachel smiled, falling into step beside her. "I know you're strong and all, but sometimes it's nice to have company." Eleanor's lips twitched into the faintest of smiles. "Sometimes it is." The two women walked in companionable silence for a while, Bear trotting alongside them. Rachel broke the quiet eventually. "My mom always said neighborhoods are like gardens," she said softly. "You take care of them, and they bloom. But if you let weeds take over, everything good gets choked out." Eleanor glanced at her. "That is wise," Rachel shrugged. "It's just been on my mind since last night. I hate that something like that happened to you." Eleanor's gaze lingered on the sidewalk ahead. "It happens more often than you might think." Rachel's expression hardened. "It shouldn't." They rounded another corner, and Rachel suddenly stopped. "Here." She reached into her canvas bag and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. "It's my number," she said, handing it to Eleanor. "Call me any time, day or night, if you need something, or if you just want company." Eleanor took the slip of paper, surprised at the gesture. "You don't have to do this," she said softly. "I know I don't," Rachel replied. "But I want to." Eleanor looked at the number, then back at Rachel. There was no pity in her expression, no hidden agenda, just genuine care. It was something Eleanor hadn't seen in a long time. "Thank you," Eleanor said finally. Rachel smiled. "We're in this together, Mrs. Brooks. You and Bear have got backup now." They continued walking, the street growing quieter as night settled in. Eleanor felt something shift inside her, like a small weight had lifted. For so long, she had believed herself to be alone, that her strength was hers to carry on her own. But now, there was Rachel. There was Mr. Bennet, and Bear, always at her side. Maybe strength wasn't just about standing alone. Maybe it was about letting others stand with you. As Eleanor and Bear returned home, Rachel waved goodbye from the street, her smile bright in the dimming light. Eleanor stepped inside and shut the door behind her, the warmth of the house greeting her. She set Rachel's number on the counter, glanced at Bear and whispered, "Looks like we've got some good people around us, boy." Bear wagged his tail, settling near her feet as she sank into her chair. For the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that things might just start to change. The morning sun spilled through the curtains, casting soft light across Eleanor Brooks' modest kitchen. She stood at the counter, pouring herself a cup of coffee, as Bear's tail thumped against the floor in his usual spot by her feet. The house felt warmer today, not because of the weather, but because of something quieter, something she couldn't yet name. She glanced at the slip of paper Rachel had given her the night before, still sitting on the counter where she'd left it. There had been a time when Eleanor wouldn't have considered calling someone. Samuel had been her anchor for so long that after he passed, she'd grown used to handling things on her own. People came and went. Kind words were fleeting. So, what was the point? But Rachel was different. She had stepped in, unprompted and unafraid, to help Eleanor during her most vulnerable moment. It was a small act, but it had lingered with Eleanor through the quiet hours of the night, as though someone had cracked open the door to a room she thought had been locked forever. Eleanor took her coffee and stepped onto the front porch. Bear followed, settling beside her, as she sat down in Samuel's old chair. From her vantage point, she could see James Bennet across the street, standing in his yard, with his hands tucked into his worn coat pockets. He seemed to be staring at something, a fence, a tree, or maybe nothing at all. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up and tipped his chin in greeting. Eleanor returned the gesture with a small wave. It still surprised her how quickly her interactions with him had changed. James had always been a man of few words, often appearing gruff or distant, but his presence the other morning had been reassuring. As Eleanor sat sipping her coffee, she noticed a woman walking down the street pushing a stroller. It was Clara Thompson, a single mother who lived a block away. She often kept to herself, but Eleanor had seen her enough times to know the woman's quiet rhythm of life. As Clara passed, she offered Eleanor a polite wave. To Eleanor's surprise, she stopped. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," Clara said with a shy smile. "I hope I'm not interrupting you." "Not at all," Eleanor replied, lowering her cup. Clara shifted her weight slightly, glancing toward Bear, who stared back with polite disinterest. "I heard about what happened the other night. It's awful, what you had to go through." Eleanor stiffened slightly, though she managed a composed nod. "It's nothing I haven't faced before." Clara's brow furrowed. "Well, it shouldn't be something you face at all." She hesitated, then added softly, "I just wanted to say I think you're incredibly brave." Eleanor blinked at her, surprised. "Thank you." Clara seemed emboldened by Eleanor's response. "If you ever need anything, someone to run errands or walk with you, you can call me. We live close enough." She reached into the pocket of her stroller bag and pulled out a small card with her phone number scribbled on it. "I know it's not much, but sometimes it's easier when someone's with you." Eleanor accepted the card, her heart warming despite herself. "That's very kind of you, Clara." Clara smiled, a bit brighter now, as though Eleanor's acknowledgement gave her confidence. "Well, kindness goes a long way," she said simply. "You and Bear take care." Eleanor watched her leave, feeling that same crack in her resolve widening. First Rachel, now Clara. These were small gestures, but they rippled outward, softening the edges of her world. That afternoon, Eleanor decided to test her resolve and attend the neighborhood watch meeting. She had avoided such gatherings in the past. They were filled with polite chatter that often meant very little, and Eleanor had always felt like a silent observer in a space where her voice didn't belong. But Rachel had insisted that showing up could help change things, even if only a little. The meeting was held in the community center, a small brick building tucked at the edge of town. When Eleanor arrived, she spotted Rachel immediately, seated near the back. Rachel's face lit up when she saw her. "Mrs. Brooks, you came," Rachel said warmly, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. Eleanor nodded, settling into the chair. Bear wasn't with her today, and the absence of his protective presence made her feel exposed, though she wouldn't let it show. The meeting was led by Harold Wilkins, a man in his late 40s who fancied himself the unofficial mayor of Maple Street. He wore a crisp button-up shirt and spoke with the kind of confidence that came from rarely being questioned. "Thank you all for coming," Harold began, glancing around the small crowd. "I think we all know why this meeting is necessary. We've had an incident that reminds us we need to stay vigilant as a community." Eleanor kept her face composed as Harold's eyes skimmed over her. The word incident clung to her like a label. A handful of heads turned in her direction, some with sympathy, others with poorly hidden curiosity. Rachel leaned toward her and whispered, "Ignore them. They'll figure it out soon enough." Eleanor said nothing but appreciated Rachel's presence. Harold continued, "We need more patrols in the neighborhood and more involvement from everyone. That means reporting suspicious activity and supporting one another." James Bennett's voice cut through the room like gravel. "Supporting one another means stepping up when it matters, not waiting for the cops to clean up after us." The room fell silent, surprised by the interruption. Eleanor turned to see James sitting near the back, his arms crossed, his eyes sharp. He looked directly at Harold as he spoke. "We've got people living here who've been ignored for too long," James added, his gaze briefly flicking toward Eleanor. "That's part of the problem." Eleanor's chest tightened. She hadn't expected anyone to speak up for her, especially not James Bennet, a man whose silence she had once mistaken for indifference. Harold shifted uncomfortably, his polished tone faltering. "That's a fair point, Mr. Bennet, which is why we're having this meeting, to make sure we're all aware of what's happening and to take action." Rachel raised her hand before Harold could continue. "Action starts with being neighbors, Mr. Wilkins. It starts with showing up for each other, not just in meetings, but in the small moments." Harold's expression tightened, but he nodded. "You're right, Ms. Green. Let's work on that together." The meeting continued, but Eleanor barely heard it. Her mind lingered on James and Rachel's words. They were small acts, brief moments of acknowledgement, but they meant something. When the meeting ended, Rachel turned to Eleanor. "Well, that was something, wasn't it?" "It was," Eleanor replied quietly. James approached them on his way out, his hands shoved into his coat pockets. "Mrs. Brooks," he said with a small nod. "Mr. Bennet," she replied. He paused for a moment, then grumbled, "You're not as alone as you think." With that, he walked away, leaving Eleanor standing there with Rachel beside her. "See?" Rachel said, a smile in her voice. "I told you, one small step at a time." Eleanor looked at Rachel and realized she was right. The ripples had started. The silence that had once surrounded her wasn't as absolute as she'd believed. People were noticing. People were speaking. That evening, as Eleanor sat on her porch with Bear at her feet, she watched the sun dip below the trees. The world outside her house felt different, not wholly changed, but shifting. She reached down and scratched Bear behind his ears, her voice soft. "You hear that, boy? We're not alone anymore." Bear's tail wagged gently, his brown eyes lifting to meet hers. Eleanor smiled faintly, the warmth inside her growing a little stronger. The sky hung heavy with clouds the next morning as Eleanor Brooks sat at her kitchen table, stirring a cup of tea that had long gone cold. The events of the past few days replayed endlessly in her mind. The attack, Rachel's unexpected kindness, James Bennet speaking up during the neighborhood meeting. All of it had felt like cracks of light breaking through walls that had been built over years of quiet isolation. But this morning, a new weight pressed on her shoulders. Officer Carter had called the night before with news that made Eleanor's pulse quicken. The young man Bear had pinned Jason Miller, the tall ringleader from that awful night, was scheduled for his arraignment later in the afternoon. "Your presence will make a difference, Mrs. Brooks," Officer Carter had said gently. "We don't want the judge to think this was just a misunderstanding. If you're there, they'll understand the impact of what happened." Eleanor hadn't said much in response. She had simply promised to think about it and hung up the phone. Now, as Bear lay at her feet, chewing lazily on a rawhide bone, Eleanor stared into her cup. Her thoughts circled like storm clouds. The idea of going to court, sitting in a room where Jason and his friends might be, unnerved her. She could still hear their mocking voices, see the cold confidence in Jason's eyes as he'd stepped closer to her that day. She reached instinctively for the silver locket around her neck, running her thumb over its smooth surface. Samuel's face flashed in her mind, his steady gaze, and the words he'd always spoken when Eleanor doubted herself. "You don't let fear decide who you are, Elle." Eleanor inhaled deeply and looked down at Bear. "We're going," she said softly, as though speaking the words aloud would solidify them. Bear's ears perked at the sound of her voice, his tail tapping once against the floor. The courthouse was an imposing building of stone and glass, its steps crowded with people coming and going. Eleanor arrived alone, dressed in her best navy coat, her hat tilted slightly forward. Bear had been left at home for the day, though Eleanor wished desperately for his presence as she made her way through the doors. She felt the eyes on her immediately strangers, clerks, and the faint hum of murmured voices that seemed to follow her through the halls. The courtroom itself was small and sterile, with rows of benches that stretched toward the judge's bench at the front. Eleanor found a seat near the back, her hands folded neatly in her lap. It wasn't long before she saw him, Jason Miller. He entered the room in an orange jumpsuit, his hands cuffed in front of him. The arrogance he'd carried so boldly that night was gone now, replaced with a mix of unease and resentment. He didn't look at Eleanor, though she suspected he knew she was there. Across the aisle, Officer Carter caught Eleanor's eye and gave her a nod of reassurance. Rachel Green sat beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. The judge, a stern woman with short silver hair, entered the room and brought it to order with the sharp strike of her gavel. This court will hear the charges against Jason Miller: attempted robbery, assault, and intimidation. Eleanor felt the words like a chill against her skin. Assault, intimidation. Hearing the truth spoken so plainly made her chest tighten. Jason's attorney, a man in a rumpled suit, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, Mr. Miller is a young man who made a mistake. He was influenced by others and had no real intention to harm anyone. This was a moment of poor judgment, not malice." Eleanor's jaw tightened. A mistake. The word grated against her like sandpaper. Mistakes were accidental, a wrong turn, or a broken dish. What Jason had done was deliberate. The attorney continued, glancing toward Eleanor. "And while we regret the misunderstanding with Mrs. Brooks, we believe the charges should be reduced." Eleanor stiffened. Misunderstanding. The word settled like a stone in her chest. She wanted to stand up and shout that there had been no misunderstanding, that Jason and his friends had hunted her like prey, that they had threatened her life and underestimated her value. But instead, she held her composure, her eyes fixed on Jason. The prosecutor, a woman named Jessica Nguyen, rose to respond. Her voice was sharp and deliberate, cutting through the air like a blade. "Your Honor, this was no misunderstanding. Jason Miller and his accomplices targeted Mrs. Brooks because they thought she was an easy victim, an older woman walking alone. They threatened her, surrounded her, and escalated to violence. It was only thanks to Mrs. Brooks's courage and her dog's intervention that a tragedy was avoided." Eleanor's chest swelled slightly at Jessica's words. Courage. She hadn't thought of herself that way, but hearing it spoken aloud gave her strength. Jessica continued, "This is not about youthful mistakes. It is about accountability. Jason Miller acted with intent, and justice must be served." The judge listened silently, her expression unreadable. After a pause, she spoke. "Given the nature of the charges and the evidence presented, this court finds sufficient cause to proceed to trial." Jason shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Eleanor watched him carefully, noting the flicker of fear that passed across his face. It wasn't the kind of fear she would wish on anyone, but it was the consequence of his choices. The judge struck her gavel again. "Mr. Miller will remain in custody until his trial date is set." With that, the room began to empty. Jason was led away by a guard, his gaze fixed on the floor. Eleanor rose slowly, her legs feeling unsteady as she turned to leave. "Mrs. Brooks." The voice startled her. She turned to find Jessica Nguyen approaching, her expression kind but serious. "I wanted to thank you for being here today. Your presence makes a difference." Eleanor nodded, though she wasn't sure how to respond. "It is not easy," she admitted softly. "I know," Jessica replied. "But you're showing us that what happened matters. People like Jason think they can get away with things because no one will fight back. You're proving them wrong." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard by the weight of Jessica's words. "I only did what I had to," she said finally. Jessica smiled faintly. "Sometimes that's all it takes." Rachel was waiting for her outside the courtroom, leaning casually against the wall. "You were incredible in there," she said, as Eleanor approached. "I did not say anything," Eleanor replied. "You didn't have to." Rachel pushed off the wall and fell into step beside her. "You showed up, and that speaks louder than words." Eleanor glanced at her, surprised by the earnestness in Rachel's tone. "I am not sure how much good it will do." Rachel stopped, her hand resting lightly on Eleanor's arm. "Mrs. Brooks, I know this feels heavy, and maybe it seems like nothing has changed, but it will. You've already started something." Eleanor studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Perhaps." Rachel smiled, falling silent as they walked through the courthouse doors and into the cool afternoon air. The sky remained heavy with clouds, but Eleanor felt lighter somehow, less alone, less invisible. When she returned home later that day, Bear greeted her at the door with a joyful bark, his tail wagging furiously. Eleanor knelt beside him, scratching behind his ears as she murmured, "I did it, boy. I went." Bear licked her hand, his eyes filled with the kind of loyalty that had never wavered. Eleanor let out a slow breath, rising to her feet. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in years, she felt like someone had seen her, heard her, and stood beside her. That night, as she sat on the porch, the faint hum of the neighborhood drifted around her. The world was not fixed, not yet, but something had shifted, something small but important. Eleanor could feel it. For the first time, she allowed herself to believe that change was possible. The day after Jason Miller's arraignment, Eleanor Brooks sat at her kitchen table once again, Bear curled up at her feet. The courtroom's tense silence lingered in her memory, but so did the prosecutor Jessica Nguyen's words. "You're proving them wrong." Eleanor hadn't seen herself as a symbol of strength, but it seemed others were starting to. The sky outside was gray, drizzling with the kind of light rain that made the world feel hushed. Eleanor didn't mind the quiet, it gave her time to think. The doorbell rang suddenly, breaking her thoughts. Bear shot up, barking as he rushed toward the front door. Eleanor followed, steadying herself as she opened it. To her surprise, Rachel Green stood there holding a small tray with a foil cover, her hair tucked under a hood. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," Rachel said brightly, though the rain had dampened the edges of her jacket. "Hope I'm not interrupting." Eleanor raised an eyebrow. "Not at all." She stepped back to let Rachel inside. Rachel set the tray on the kitchen counter, pulling back the foil with a flourish. "I baked banana bread last night. Thought you might like some." Eleanor blinked, the unexpected kindness catching her off guard. The smell of the warm bread wafted into the room, filling the air with sweetness. "You didn't need to do that," Eleanor said softly, though she could feel a smile tugging at her lips. Rachel shrugged, leaning casually against the counter. "I wanted to. Besides, I figured we both deserved a treat after yesterday." Eleanor nodded, her hand brushing Bear's back to calm him. "Thank you, Rachel. It's very kind of you." Rachel grinned. "It's just banana bread, nothing fancy." But Eleanor knew better. It wasn't about the bread. It was about the thought, the effort, the act of showing up. Rachel was the kind of person who understood that small gestures carried weight. "Have a seat," Eleanor offered, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Rachel hesitated for only a moment before settling into one of the chairs. Eleanor sliced the banana bread, placing 2 pieces onto plates and pouring tea into cups. "This is really nice," Rachel said as she took a bite, her eyes lighting up. "Your home feels warm, peaceful." Eleanor sat across from her, glancing briefly around the room. The house was simple, well kept, but filled with little reminders of Samuel, framed photographs, his old reading chair by the window, and the quiet hum of a life they'd built together. "Thank you," Eleanor replied, her voice soft. Rachel sipped her tea, her expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been thinking about yesterday, what happened in court. It shouldn't have to be like that, people trying to twist the truth or dismiss what happened to you." Eleanor's gaze drifted to the window, where rain streaked softly against the glass. "It is not the first time I've been underestimated," she said simply, "but I will not let it stop me." Rachel smiled, admiration clear in her expression. "That's what I respect about you. You don't back down. Not in court, not on the street, not anywhere." Eleanor felt a flicker of warmth at Rachel's words. For so long, she had moved through the world quietly, unwilling to burden others with her struggles. Now, with Rachel sitting across from her, it felt as though someone truly saw her for the first time in years. The sound of rain pattering against the roof filled the silence for a moment, before Rachel spoke again. "A few of us from the neighborhood have been talking." Eleanor's eyebrows lifted slightly. "About what?" "About what happened to you. About what's been happening here for a long time," Rachel explained, her tone serious now. "We've let too much slide. People keep to themselves and pretend not to see what's wrong, but we can't do that anymore." Eleanor's expression remained guarded, though her interest was piqued. "And what do you plan to do?" Rachel leaned forward, her voice earnest. "I want to start a community safety group, something simple at first. More people looking out for each other, more walking groups in the evenings. Maybe we can even get the city to add better streetlights. Small things that can make a big difference." Eleanor considered her words, stirring her tea thoughtfully. "That sounds ambitious." "It's only ambitious if we try to fix everything all at once," Rachel countered. "But we don't have to. We just have to start." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line, her thoughts circling. She had spent so much of her life managing things on her own that the idea of relying on others or expecting them to care felt foreign. And yet, Rachel had been there for her. James Bennett had spoken up. Clara Thompson had stopped to offer help. Maybe people really were starting to change. Rachel studied Eleanor's face and smiled softly. "You don't have to decide now, but I hope you'll think about being a part of it." Eleanor met Rachel's gaze, surprised by how much hope flickered there. "I will think about it," she said finally. The next morning, Eleanor decided to test the waters of Rachel's idea. It was still drizzling lightly as she clipped Bear's leash onto his collar and stepped outside for her usual walk. To her surprise, she spotted Clara Thompson standing at the end of her driveway, holding her young daughter's hand. "Good morning, Mrs. Brooks," Clara called out, waving slightly. Eleanor nodded in response. "Good morning?" Clara smiled as she adjusted her daughter's raincoat. "Mind if we walk with you for a bit? I figured it'd be nice to get out, even with the weather." Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I do not mind." Together, they walked slowly down the sidewalk, Bear leading the way with his usual quiet authority. Clara's daughter, a little girl with bright eyes and bouncing curls, kept glancing up at Bear with fascination. "Is he a nice dog?" the girl asked timidly. Eleanor smiled faintly. "He's the nicest dog there is as long as you're polite to him." The little girl giggled, clutching her mother's hand a bit tighter as they walked. Clara glanced at Eleanor as they rounded a corner. "I know it might not seem like much, but I think people are starting to pay attention. My neighbor told me he's been keeping an eye out since what happened to you." Eleanor hummed thoughtfully. "I hope that's true." "It is," Clara insisted gently. "Change takes time, but it's happening, and you started it." Eleanor didn't reply right away, but her heart swelled at the thought. Could it really be true? Could her simple act of standing up for herself ripple outward in ways she hadn't imagined? As they walked past James Bennett's house, the old man stepped outside onto his porch, a mug of coffee in one hand. He gave a small nod of acknowledgement as they passed. "Morning, Mrs. Brooks. Morning, Clara." "Good morning, Mr. Bennett," Eleanor called back, feeling Bear tug gently on his leash. "You've got quite the group there," James added, his voice gruff but warm. Eleanor glanced at Clara and her daughter, then back at James. "It seems I do." James smiled faintly before retreating into his house. As they continued walking, Eleanor felt something in her chest loosen, something she hadn't realized she'd been holding on to for years. She looked down at Bear, who trotted happily beside her, then back at Clara and her daughter, who were chatting softly as they walked. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt something close to peace. The neighborhood, once silent and distant, was beginning to stir awake, and as she walked with Bear leading the way, she realized she wasn't walking alone anymore. That evening, Eleanor picked up the phone and dialed the number Rachel had given her. "Rachel, it's Eleanor," she said simply. Rachel's voice lit up on the other end. "Mrs. Brooks, how are you?" "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor replied, her tone steady. "About the group. I'd like to help." Rachel's excitement was clear. "That's wonderful. I knew you'd come around." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile as Bear settled at her feet. "Let me know what you need, Rachel. It's time we start making changes." And for the first time in years, Eleanor believed it. The next morning brought a bright, clear sky to Maple Street, sunlight filtering through the oaks in dappled patches. Eleanor Brooks stood at her front window, watching the neighborhood wake up as she cradled her cup of coffee. Bear sat beside her, his head resting on her knee. For once, the street felt different, not entirely free of tension, but less stifling than it had been for so long. The conversation with Rachel the night before lingered in Eleanor's mind. Safety groups. She still wasn't sure what her involvement would look like, but she had agreed to help. The promise felt weighty yet purposeful. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires crunching slowly over gravel. Eleanor stiffened. Through the window, she spotted a pickup truck, not Jason's, but the same kind of old, rusted vehicle coasting down the street. It moved too slowly to be casual, the hum of its engine deliberate. Eleanor's pulse quickened as her mind raced back to that awful night. Her hands gripped her coffee cup more tightly as she watched the truck crawl past her house, the driver hidden behind tinted windows. Bear sensed her tension and lifted his head, letting out a low, rumbling growl. "Quiet, boy," Eleanor murmured, her voice calm despite the tightness in her chest. The truck passed, turning the corner and disappearing from view. Eleanor let out a slow breath, though her heart continued to pound. Her eyes lingered on the street as if daring it to betray her again. The light that had started to grow, fueled by Rachel's kindness, Clara's quiet support, and James' surprising resolve, now flickered like a fragile flame. That afternoon, Rachel stopped by with a box of printed flyers. "I figured we'd start with these," she said, spreading one out on Eleanor's kitchen table. It was simple but clear. Community Safety Group. Looking out for one another starts with us. Join our first meeting this Saturday at the community center. Together, we can make a difference. Rachel looked up at Eleanor with a hopeful smile. "I thought we could hand these out around the neighborhood, put them in mailboxes, stop by the diner places like that." Eleanor studied the flyer, her hand resting near the edge of it. The words "together" and "looking out for one another" seemed to leap off the page. "It's a good start," she admitted quietly. Rachel beamed. "We'll get there, Mrs. Brooks. You'll see." Together, they walked through the neighborhood, Bear trotting loyally beside Eleanor as they went door to door. Most houses were silent, with only the occasional flutter of curtains or a muffled voice behind a door. But a few residents stepped out to meet them, people like Clara, who took the flyer with an encouraging smile, or Mr. Bennett, who grunted his approval before pocketing the paper. By the time they returned to Eleanor's porch, the sun was dipping low on the horizon, painting the sky in warm golds and reds. Rachel dropped onto the porch swing with a sigh, smiling as she glanced at Bear, who sat panting contentedly at Eleanor's feet. "You know," Rachel said, her voice soft, "I think people are starting to care. They just needed a push." Eleanor lowered herself into Samuel's old chair, her gaze sweeping over the quiet street. "I hope you're right." Rachel leaned forward, her elbows on her knees. "Have a little faith, Mrs. Brooks. Things are already changing because of you." Eleanor didn't reply, but she felt a flicker of something deep in her chest, a fragile sense of hope. That night, Eleanor moved through the house, locking doors and checking windows before settling into bed. Bear, as always, lay curled on the rug by her side. She reached over and clicked off the lamp, the room sinking into darkness. Sleep did not come easily. Her mind lingered on the pickup truck from earlier, its slow crawl up the street like a shadow she couldn't shake. She told herself it was nothing, just a passing vehicle, a coincidence. But the unease dug deep, and her dreams that night were restless, filled with fragments of Jason's mocking voice and the sound of Bear's growls. The next morning, Eleanor awoke early, still feeling the weight of the night's unsettled sleep. As she poured her coffee, a knock came at the door. Bear barked once, his tail wagging as he trotted toward the sound. Eleanor opened the door to find James Bennett standing on her porch, hands shoved into the pockets of his coat. "Morning," he said gruffly. "Good morning, Mr. Bennett." Eleanor frowned slightly, surprised to see him. "Is something wrong?" He shifted on his feet, glancing toward the street. "I saw a truck hanging around here yesterday," he said finally. "Didn't like the look of it. Seemed familiar." Eleanor's stomach dropped, though she kept her expression composed. "I noticed it too," she admitted. James nodded, his gaze steady. "Thought you should know. I'll keep an eye out." "Thank you," Eleanor said softly, the words carrying more weight than she intended. James cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable for a moment before stepping back. "Take care of yourself, Mrs. Brooks, and that dog of yours too." With that, he turned and walked back toward his house. Eleanor watched him go, her mind swirling. Later that day, Eleanor sat on the porch with Bear at her feet, her eyes scanning the street as though waiting for something to happen. The world seemed quieter than usual, too quiet. The sound of an approaching engine broke the silence. Eleanor tensed, her hand instinctively resting on Bear's head. But this time, it wasn't a pickup truck. It was a police cruiser pulling up in front of her house. Officer Mike Carter stepped out, his expression calm but serious. He walked up to the porch, tipping his hat in greeting. "Afternoon, Mrs. Brooks." "Good afternoon, officer," Eleanor replied, standing slowly. "I just wanted to check in," Carter said. "We've been patrolling more regularly around here. I heard from Mr. Bennett that you noticed a truck yesterday." "I did," Eleanor admitted. "It looked like the kind Jason Miller and his friends were driving that night." Carter nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It might be nothing, but we'll keep an eye out. I also wanted to let you know that 2 of Jason's friends have been identified, and we're close to tracking them down." Eleanor let out a slow breath, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "Thank you for letting me know." Carter studied her for a moment before speaking again. "I know this has been difficult, but you're doing more than you realize. You're not just standing up for yourself, you're standing up for the whole community." Eleanor's lips twitched into a faint smile. "I am just doing what I have to." Carter smiled back. "Sometimes that's enough." As he walked back to his cruiser, Eleanor sank back into her chair, Bear settling beside her. She thought about Rachel and James, about the safety group they were trying to start. She thought about the neighbors who had begun stepping forward, even if only in small ways. The truck might come back, and the shadows might linger, but Eleanor was no longer fighting alone. She looked down at Bear, who watched her with those calm, steady eyes. "We'll be fine, boy," she murmured. "We'll face whatever comes." Bear wagged his tail softly, as though he understood. The neighborhood around her remained quiet, but Eleanor no longer felt the heavy stillness that had kept her isolated for so long. Change was slow, painfully slow, but it was happening. And for the first time in years, Eleanor allowed herself to believe that hope, no matter how fragile, was worth holding on to. The sun hung low in the sky as Eleanor Brooks stood at her kitchen sink, rinsing a dish while Bear rested at her feet. Outside, Maple Street looked peaceful. The sound of children playing echoed faintly in the distance, and a light breeze rustled the leaves on the old oak trees. It was the kind of day Eleanor might have once enjoyed without a second thought. Now, she found herself watching the street carefully, her gaze lingering on every car that passed. The conversation with Officer Carter still played in her mind. 2 of Jason Miller's friends have been identified. The news had brought a measure of relief, but it also left Eleanor feeling exposed, as though the men who had escaped might return at any moment. Fear was a hard thing to shake, even when logic told her she was safe. Bear lifted his head, ears twitching, as he let out a low growl. Eleanor's hand paused mid-motion, the plate in her fingers still slick with soap. "What is it, boy?" she murmured. The growl faded, but Bear remained alert, his gaze fixed on the front window. Eleanor dried her hands on a dish towel, feeling the now familiar prickling at the back of her neck. Stepping to the window, she parted the curtain just enough to peer outside. A pickup truck, dark and rusted, was parked halfway down the street. Eleanor's chest tightened. It wasn't moving, but it was there. She could see the faint outline of someone in the driver's seat, though the tinted windows kept the figure hidden. Bear let out another soft growl. Eleanor closed the curtain, her mind racing. Was it them? Were they watching her? Before she could decide what to do, the phone rang, startling her. She hurried to answer, her voice steady despite the nerves tightening her throat. "Hello? It's Rachel," came the familiar warm voice on the other end. "Mrs. Brooks, are you okay?" Eleanor frowned slightly. "I'm fine. Why do you ask?" "I'm just down the street," Rachel explained. "I was heading home from the diner and saw a truck parked near your house. It looked off. I just wanted to check on you." Eleanor's grip on the phone tightened. "I see it too." "Stay inside," Rachel said quickly. "I'll call Officer Carter. He'll take care of it." Eleanor hesitated, glancing toward the front window. For so long, her instinct had been to handle things alone. But now, with Rachel's steady voice on the other end of the line, the loneliness that had accompanied her fear began to recede. "All right," she said finally. "I'll wait." 20 minutes later, Eleanor heard the familiar hum of a car engine followed by the sound of tires crunching on gravel. Bear perked up, his tail swishing as a black and white police cruiser came to a stop in front of her house. Through the window, Eleanor saw Officer Mike Carter step out, his posture calm but purposeful. She opened the door as he approached the porch. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Brooks," Carter greeted, his tone kind but professional. "Rachel called me about the truck." Eleanor nodded, stepping back slightly to let him in. "It's been sitting there for a while. I don't know if it's them, but—" Carter held up a hand to stop her. "You did the right thing calling us. I'll go check it out." Eleanor stayed inside as Carter walked back down the steps and toward the truck. Her heart pounded, the minutes stretching out as though they were hours. From her spot near the window, she could see Carter approach the vehicle, speaking to whoever sat inside. After a tense moment, the truck started up, rumbling loudly before pulling away. Carter watched it disappear down the block before returning to the house. Eleanor opened the door as he walked up the porch. "Was it them?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. Carter shook his head. "No, it wasn't. The driver was just a kid from a few neighborhoods over. Said he'd parked there to use his phone because he was out of gas. I don't think he's connected to Jason or the others." Eleanor let out a slow breath, though the tension in her shoulders remained. "But you're sure?" "I'm sure," Carter replied firmly, "but I'll keep a report on file and we'll increase patrols around here. I won't take any chances." Eleanor nodded, brushing Bear's back for comfort. "Thank you, Officer Carter." Carter's expression softened. "Mrs. Brooks, I know this is hard, but you're not alone in this anymore. If something feels wrong, call us me, Rachel. Anyone. People are looking out for you." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "I'll keep that in mind." As Carter left, Eleanor closed the door and stood in the quiet of her living room. For so long, her instinct had been to brush things off, to keep her troubles to herself. Now, she couldn't deny the growing truth. Rachel, Carter, James Bennett, and even Clara had all made it clear they were willing to stand with her. That evening, Eleanor took Bear for his usual walk. The sun was setting, casting a soft orange glow across Maple Street. She kept to familiar paths, Bear's steady presence beside her offering comfort. When they rounded the corner onto Willow Lane, Eleanor saw Mr. Bennett standing near his fence, a hammer in hand, as he worked to repair a broken board. He looked up as she approached. "Evening, Mrs. Brooks," he greeted, his gruff voice carrying across the quiet street. "Good evening, Mr. Bennett." Eleanor paused, watching as he adjusted the loose board before driving a nail into place. "Your fence has seen better days." James smirked faintly. "Most things have, but it's nothing a little work can't fix." Eleanor considered his words as Bear sniffed around the edge of the lawn. "Thank you for telling Officer Carter about the truck," she said finally. James set down the hammer and turned to look at her, his expression softening. "You're welcome. I keep an eye on things, even if people don't think I do." Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. "It seems a lot of us have been keeping to ourselves for too long." James grunted in agreement. "Maybe so, but things are changing now. Because of you." The words surprised her, though she kept her face composed. "I'm just doing what needs to be done." "That's more than most," James replied. He glanced at Bear, who was now sitting patiently beside Eleanor. "You've got that dog watching your back. The rest of us? We're catching up." Eleanor smiled faintly, the warmth in her chest undeniable. "It's good to hear that, Mr. Bennett." As she and Bear continued their walk, Eleanor's mind turned over the events of the day, the truck that had stirred her fear, Carter's reassurance, and James's quiet but steady presence. For years, she had believed her battles were hers alone to fight. Now, for the first time in a long time, it felt as though others were stepping in to share the burden. Later that night, as Eleanor sat on her porch sipping tea, Rachel called. "Hey, Mrs. Brooks," Rachel said warmly. "I heard from Carter that it wasn't them. You okay?" "I'm fine," Eleanor replied softly. "Thank you for looking out for me." "Always," Rachel said firmly. "Oh, and we've got a date for the safety group's first meeting. It's this Saturday. I hope you'll be there." "I'll be there," Eleanor said, surprising even herself. "Good," Rachel replied with a smile in her voice. "We'll get this neighborhood back on track together." As Eleanor hung up, she looked out at the quiet street, the faint hum of crickets filling the night air. She reached down, scratching Bear's ears as he lay at her feet. "We're not alone anymore, boy," she murmured. Bear wagged his tail, his eyes lifting to meet hers. The weight of fear still lingered, but now it felt lighter, more manageable. Eleanor knew the road ahead would not be easy. There would be more shadows, more moments of doubt. But she would not face them alone. For the first time in years, the quiet of Maple Street felt less like a burden and more like a promise of better days to come. The morning of the safety group's first meeting arrived with a clear blue sky and a crisp breeze that carried the faint scent of autumn leaves. Eleanor Brooks stood at her bathroom mirror, adjusting the brim of her navy hat. It was the same hat she wore on her daily walks, simple, neat, and familiar. But today, it felt different. Today, Eleanor wasn't just showing up for herself. She was showing up for her community. She glanced at Bear, who sat at the doorway watching her intently, his tail swishing across the floor. "We've got work to do today, boy," she said softly, her voice steady. Bear tilted his head as though he understood, and Eleanor smiled faintly. The phone rang, breaking the quiet hum of the house. Eleanor moved to the kitchen to answer, her hand steady on the receiver. "Morning, Mrs. Brooks," Rachel's cheerful voice greeted her. "I'm just checking in before the meeting. How are you feeling?" Eleanor hesitated, glancing out the window toward Maple Street. "I'm all right, Rachel." "You don't have to do anything you're not ready for," Rachel said gently. but I'm really glad you're coming. You're kind of our unofficial leader, you know." Eleanor huffed lightly, though her lips curved into the smallest of smiles. "Leader? I don't think so." "You'd be surprised how much you've inspired people," Rachel replied. "Anyway, I'll see you at the community center in an hour. Let's make this a good day." Eleanor hung up the phone, her smile lingering. "Inspired," she murmured to herself. The word felt too big, too generous. She wasn't a leader. She was just a woman who refused to back down when the world pushed too hard. Still, as she clipped Bear's leash onto his collar and stepped outside, Eleanor felt something shift within her. It wasn't about being brave or being strong, it was about showing up. The Maple Street Community Center was a small brick building with large glass windows and a faded blue sign out front. When Eleanor arrived, Bear trotting loyally beside her, she was surprised to see so many cars parked in the lot. Rachel stood by the entrance, her ponytail bouncing as she waved. "Mrs. Brooks, you made it." Eleanor nodded, walking toward her. "It seems you've gathered quite a crowd." "People want change," Rachel replied, holding the door open as Eleanor stepped inside. "It's about time we gave them a way to make it happen." The center's main room was bright, with folding chairs arranged in rows facing a table at the front. Eleanor recognized a few familiar faces: Clara Thompson, holding her young daughter on her lap; James Bennett, sitting stiffly in the back with his arms crossed; Officer Mike Carter, standing near the door, chatting with a small group of neighbors. There were others, two neighbors Eleanor had seen over the years, but had never spoken to. Young families, older couples, single men and women who had quietly kept to themselves, just as she had. Today, though, the room hummed with low conversations and a sense of anticipation. Rachel stepped to the front of the room, clapping her hands lightly to get everyone's attention. "Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming." The conversations quieted, and all eyes turned to Rachel as she continued. "We're here today because we all want the same thing, a safer, stronger community. We've let too much slip through the cracks. Too many times we've turned our heads and said, 'It's not my problem.' But what happens to one of us affects all of us." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Rachel's gaze swept the room, landing briefly on Eleanor. When Mrs. Brooks stood up against what happened to her, she didn't just protect herself. She reminded us all what it means to take a stand. That's why we're here. Because this is our neighborhood, and it's time we take it back. Eleanor felt the heat of the room's attention shifting toward her. She kept her face calm, but her pulse quickened slightly. Rachel wasn't wrong, but the thought of being held up as an example still felt strange. "Now," Rachel continued, "Officer Carter is going to talk a little about what we can do right now to make Maple Street safer. After that, we'll talk about forming walking groups, coordinating neighborhood patrols, and ways we can support each other day to day." Officer Carter stepped to the front, his presence calm and commanding. "Thanks, Rachel," he said, his voice deep and steady. "Folks, I'm going to be honest. What happened to Mrs. Brooks isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a pattern, one we see when people think they can get away with causing harm because no one will speak up." Eleanor shifted in her seat, Bear pressing closer to her leg as though sensing her unease. Carter continued, "But the truth is, they're wrong. We've already made progress identifying Jason Miller's accomplices, and I promise you, justice will be served. In the meantime, the best way for us to protect Maple Street is to work together. Report anything suspicious. Keep your doors locked. Walk in pairs or groups, especially in the evenings. And most importantly, look out for your neighbors." As Carter spoke, Eleanor noticed heads nodding in agreement. People were listening, really listening. It wasn't just empty talk, it was a community waking up. When Carter finished, Rachel called for volunteers to help form the walking groups. Clara raised her hand first, smiling brightly as her daughter played with a small stuffed bear in her lap. Mr. Bennett grumbled from the back, but lifted his hand reluctantly, earning a chuckle from those nearby. Slowly, more hands went up, and the room began to buzz with quiet energy. Rachel turned to Eleanor. "Would you like to say a few words, Mrs. Brooks?" Eleanor froze for half a second, the room suddenly too still. Say a few words? It was something Samuel would have done effortlessly, but Eleanor had always been a quieter soul. Rachel smiled encouragingly. "Please, I think it'd mean a lot to everyone here." Eleanor glanced down at Bear, who looked up at her with his calm, unwavering gaze. She exhaled slowly, then rose from her seat. The room turned silent as she walked to the front, each step deliberate and steady. When she turned to face the crowd, she saw something unexpected in their eyes: respect, support. Eleanor cleared her throat, her voice steady but quiet. "I've lived on Maple Street for over 30 years, she began. "When my husband, Samuel, and I moved here, it was a place where neighbors knew one another. We looked out for each other. But over the years, something changed. We all started keeping to ourselves, pretending not to see things that didn't concern us." She paused, letting the words settle. "I did the same thing. I told myself I was strong enough to handle things alone. But the truth is, no one should have to." The room remained silent, every eye fixed on her. "What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone," Eleanor continued, her voice firm now. "And I'm not here asking for pity. I'm here to remind you that we are stronger together. If we want Maple Street to feel like home again, we need to show up for one another. No more silence. No more pretending we don't see." She looked out across the room, her gaze meeting Rachel's, Clara's, and even James Bennett's steady eyes. "I'm not afraid anymore, and you shouldn't be either." The room broke into soft applause. Rachel smiled proudly, her hands clapping the loudest. Mr. Bennett gave a small nod, the corners of his mouth twitching as though he were fighting a smile. Eleanor returned to her seat, feeling Bear press against her leg. Rachel leaned over, whispering, "You did amazing." Eleanor smiled faintly, her chest light with something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. By the end of the meeting, plans were in motion. Groups were formed, patrol schedules drafted, and neighbors exchanged phone numbers. As Eleanor stepped outside with Bear at her side, Rachel joined her. "Look at what you started," Rachel said softly. "This is because of you, Mrs. Brooks." Eleanor glanced back at the small crowd still mingling near the community center's doors. She shook her head gently. "It's because of all of us." As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, Eleanor and Bear walked home, the familiar streets feeling a little less lonely. Maple Street wasn't perfect yet, but it was changing. And Eleanor knew, deep down, that sometimes change began with a single step forward. Bear wagged his tail as they rounded the corner, and Eleanor whispered, more to herself than to him, "We're stronger together, boy. That's how we'll keep moving forward." For the first time in years, Eleanor believed it. The days following the safety group's first meeting brought a subtle yet undeniable shift to Maple Street. It wasn't a sudden, sweeping transformation. It was quieter, like the first signs of spring after a long, bitter winter. Neighbors who had once kept their eyes down now exchanged waves as they passed. Porch lights stayed on later into the night. Familiar faces walked in groups instead of alone, their footsteps filling the sidewalks with a new sense of purpose. Eleanor Brooks noticed these changes from her usual spot on the porch, Bear sitting at her feet, his gaze sweeping the street with watchful calm. She had become part of this new rhythm, no longer an observer, but a quiet participant. She still preferred her solitude, but she now welcomed the occasional interruptions, a knock at the door, a phone call, or a friendly greeting during her evening walks. Rachel Green stopped by nearly every day, updating Eleanor on the progress of the group. They'd arranged walking schedules, reached out to other neighborhoods, and even convinced the city to install a brighter streetlight on Willow Lane. It wasn't everything, but it was something. Late one afternoon, Eleanor sat at the kitchen table, flipping through a book she hadn't touched in years. Bear was napping near the back door when the phone rang. its shrill tones startling them both. Eleanor picked up the receiver, her brow furrowing slightly, as Officer Mike Carter's familiar voice greeted her. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Brooks," he said. "I have some news I thought you'd want to hear." Eleanor's fingers tightened on the phone. "What is it?" "We've arrested the last of Jason Miller's friends, the two who were identified a few days ago," Carter explained. "It took a little time, but we tracked them down. They're in custody now." Eleanor exhaled slowly, the weight of his words settling in her chest. "You're sure it's them?" "I'm sure," Carter replied firmly. "They won't be bothering anyone again for a long time. The case is solid, and the DA's office plans to move forward with charges against all of them." Eleanor closed her eyes for a brief moment, absorbing the news. Relief spread through her, loosening the tightness in her shoulders. "Thank you, Officer Carter," she said quietly. "You did more than you know, Mrs. Brooks," Carter said. "Your courage helped us get here. If you hadn't spoken up, they might still be out there." Eleanor hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the window where sunlight pooled across the yard. "I didn't do it alone," she said finally. Carter chuckled softly. "Fair enough. But you're a big part of it. Take care, Mrs. Brooks." As the call ended, Eleanor sat still for a moment, letting the quiet of the house wrap around her. Bear trotted over, nudging her knee with his nose as if sensing her thoughts. "It's over, boy," she murmured, reaching down to scratch behind his ears. "We did it." The news spread quickly through the neighborhood, carried on hushed voices and phone calls. Eleanor noticed the difference almost immediately. When she walked Bear that evening, people greeted her more warmly than before. Mr. Bennett tipped his hat from his porch, while Clara Thompson waved as she walked with her daughter. "You heard, didn't you?" Rachel said, appearing at Eleanor's side as they passed the community center. She wore her usual bright smile, her hands tucked into the pockets of her jacket. Eleanor nodded. "Officer Carter told me earlier." Rachel let out a breath, as though she'd been holding it. "It feels good to know they're off the streets." "It does," Eleanor agreed. They fell into step, Bear trotting contentedly between them. Rachel's tone softened. "You know, Mrs. Brooks, this all started with you." Eleanor shook her head. "It started with all of us. I may have stood up, but you and the others you followed." Rachel grinned. "You're still our hero, whether you like it or not." Eleanor rolled her eyes, though a faint smile tugged at her lips. "I'm no hero, Rachel. I'm just stubborn." Rachel laughed, the sound warm and light. "Well, maybe the world needs more of that." That Saturday, Eleanor was back at the community center for the second safety group meeting. This time, the room was fuller, the conversations livelier. People who had once been strangers now greeted one another with familiar smiles, sharing small victories and new ideas. Rachel led the meeting with her usual energy, but she wasn't the only one speaking. James Bennett stood near the back, his voice gruff but steady, as he described keeping an eye out for unfamiliar cars on his block. Clara Thompson spoke next, sharing how walking with other mothers in the evenings had made her feel safer. As Eleanor listened, she felt a strange mix of pride and gratitude. These small moments, these ordinary people stepping up in quiet ways, felt more powerful than she could have imagined. When Rachel called for Eleanor to say a few words, she rose from her seat without hesitation. The room quieted as she made her way to the front, Bear sitting dutifully at her feet. Eleanor looked out at the faces in front of her, people who, weeks ago, had been little more than passing figures in her life. Now they were something more. "I won't speak long," she began, her voice calm and measured. "I just want to say this thank you, not just for showing up here, but for showing up for each other. For too long, we let silence take over this neighborhood. We let fear have its way, but we've changed that." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "There's still work to do. We'll have setbacks. There will be days when it feels like nothing's getting better. But every time we show up, every time we look out for someone else, We're proving that this neighborhood belongs to us. No one else?" The room was quiet as her words settled over them. Then Rachel began clapping, and soon others joined in, the sound swelling until it filled the space. Eleanor allowed herself a small smile as she returned to her seat. That evening, Eleanor sat on her porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, Bear lying comfortably at her feet. The street was calm, the houses bathed in the soft glow of porch lights. For the first time in years, Eleanor felt like she could breathe. The burden she'd carried, the fear, the loneliness, the silence, was no longer hers alone to bear. It had been shared, carried by hands she hadn't expected, but now trusted. The front door of the house across the street creaked open, and James Bennett stepped onto his porch, his coffee mug in hand. He caught Eleanor's eye and nodded, raising his cup slightly in acknowledgement. Eleanor nodded back, a silent exchange that spoke louder than words. Further down the street, Rachel's familiar laugh carried through the air as she spoke with a group of neighbors lingering near the corner. Clara Thompson walked by with her daughter, pausing to wave before disappearing around the block. It was just a street, Eleanor thought, just a collection of houses and fences and sidewalks. But tonight, it felt like something more. It felt like home again. She reached down, brushing Bear's fur as he stirred beside her. "We're going to be just fine, boy," she said softly. "Better than fine." The wind stirred the branches of the old oaks, and the first stars of the evening blinked to life overhead. Eleanor leaned back in Samuel's chair, closing her eyes for a moment to savor the quiet. The darkness no longer felt like something to fear. Maple Street was hers again, and so was her peace. A week after the second meeting, Maple Street was alive with quiet change. The hum of voices, the warmth of porch lights, and the comforting sight of neighbors walking together all painted a picture Eleanor Brooks had once believed impossible. It wasn't perfect. Nothing ever was. But it was better, stronger. Eleanor stood in her front yard, Bear at her side, watching as Rachel Green and a group of children walked by, laughing and chatting. Further down the block, James Bennett leaned against his fence, keeping a quiet watch as he sipped his coffee. Clara Thompson waved from across the street, her daughter skipping beside her, holding a new stuffed toy. Eleanor waved back, a small smile playing at her lips. "Things are changing, boy," she said softly to Bear, who wagged his tail in response. She turned her gaze toward the street, no longer a place of fear, but one of promise. Maple Street belonged to its people again. It was a simple truth that had taken time and struggle to reclaim, but it was theirs to protect now. Eleanor knelt beside Bear, scratching behind his ears. "We did good, didn't we?" The dog licked her hand as though in agreement, his loyalty unshakable. As the sun set on Maple Street, casting everything in a warm golden light, Eleanor rose to her feet. She stood tall, her shoulders relaxed, and her heart full of something she hadn't felt in years, peace. Thank you for joining Eleanor's journey of courage, kindness, and resilience. Stories like these remind us that change starts with small steps, and that community is built when we stand together. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, and subscribe to the channel for more uplifting stories. Your support helps us continue creating content that inspires and connects us all. Subscribe now, and let's keep sharing stories of hope, strength, and the power of community. We'll see you in the next story. Until then, take care and keep spreading kindness.